Welcome to Section 6 of Introduction to Image Processing. This section covers a few of the things that can be done with color and a bit of background about how color works. Some image processing tasks can be solved by segmenting an image based on color. For example, suppose the goal is to find out the fraction of this image that has the color of ripe fruit. One way of doing that uses the notion of distance between colors. This input uses the color distance function to pick out the color red. The result is a grayscale image with darker gray for the parts of the image that are closer to red. The color distance function returns smaller numbers for colors like red and orange that are near to each other, and bigger numbers for colors like red and blue that are further from each other. There are many ways now to count the number of pixels for which the distance from red is below some threshold. A method that involves some image processing functions that are worth knowing about is to start by binarizing and negating the image so that the pixels that are close to red show up as white, which are the ones in the underlying image data. Then use the component measurements function to count up the number of ones in the image data. Dividing that number by the total number of pixels in the image gives the fraction of pixels that are close to red. The key step that made all of this possible was the function for calculating distance between colors. Distance between colors is calculated as the distance between points in a space called a color space, which is a space where different colors correspond to different points in the space. One color space that has come up in earlier sections of this course is the RGB color space, or the RGB color model, which uses three numbers to represent each color, where the three numbers give the amounts of red, green, and blue to mix together to get the color. In the RGB color model, 100 is red, for example, since that gives 1 unit of red and 0 units of green and blue. Similarly, 010 is green. Colors can be mixed, for example, so 110 is yellow, which is a mixture of red and green, and so on. The amounts of red, green, and blue can be treated as coordinates in a three-dimensional space. Here is a manipulate result with sliders for adjusting the amounts of red, green, and blue for a point in that color space. In this space, increasing R adds red, increasing G adds green, increasing B adds blue, and other colors are represented by other points in the space. A plot like this is called a 3D chromaticity plot. The RGB color model, or RGB color space, is commonly used for images that are displayed on computer screens. Computer screens are manufactured to display colors using a fine grid of red, green, and blue dots. A related color space is CMYK color space, which is based on the colors cyan, magenta, and yellow. The pixel value for any CMYK color is 1 minus the RGB pixel value. For example, coordinates 100 in the RGB color space give red, and coordinates 011 in the CMYK color space also give red. The CMYK color model is commonly used for printing, where cyan, magenta, and yellow are colors of printing ink. The K in CMYK stands for black, which is not really needed, but it is included to save on colored printing ink and to make it easier to get a blacker black in printed documents. As a three-dimensional space, CMYK color space is really just a different way of assigning coordinates in the RGB color space. Instead of the RGB coordinate 000 for black, in CMYK coordinates, black is 111, which specifies the full amounts of cyan, magenta, and yellow. Red, which is 100 in RGB color space, is 011, a mixture of magenta and yellow in CMYK color space. Other points in this space correspond to other colors obtained by mixing of cyan, magenta, and yellow. The K coordinate of the CMYK color space moves the color toward black regardless of the other coordinates. A big difference between the CMYK color model and the RGB color model is that the CMYK model is a subtractive color model, while RGB is an additive color model. The difference between subtractive and additive color shows up when the colors are combined. In an additive color model, like RGB, adding yellow and blue gives white. This works like adding two colors of light. The combination of yellow light and blue light gives white. In a subtractive color model, like CMYK, mixing of colors instead works like mixing colored ink or colored paint. For example, here is a blue CMYK image, and here is a yellow CMYK image. Mixing these images gives black rather than white. This is how mixing of colored ink works. Blue or yellow light works by adding blue or yellow to the image, but blue or yellow ink works by subtracting all colors other than blue, or all colors other than yellow from the image. The effect is that the combination of blue and yellow in a subtractive color model subtracts everything, which gives black. As already noted, the black part of CMYK is only included for convenience. It is possible to get black by mixing full amounts of cyan, magenta, and yellow, and it is also possible to get black by setting the amount of black, which is given by the fourth argument in CMYK color, to 1, which gives black regardless of the amounts of the other colors. One disadvantage of any color model that is based on combining intense saturated colors like red, green, and blue is that this is not always the most natural way to think about color. The color pink, for example, is described in the RGB color space as red added to dark green and dark blue, but in many situations it is more natural to describe pink as red blended with white, or as red added to gray, or in some other way that separates the reddish hue of the color from the brightness and from the amount of white or gray that might be mixed in. There are several ways of setting up coordinates to accomplish that separation. One approach is implemented in the hue function, which gives the hue, saturation, and brightness, or HSB color space. The first argument in the hue function specifies the hue. Hue of 0, for example, gives red. This table shows the range of hues from red to yellow to green and so on back to red. The hue variable ranges from 0 to 1 and cycles from red to green to blue and back to red. The second argument in the hue function specifies saturation, which gives the distance of the color from gray. When hue is set to 0 for red, saturation of 1/2 gives pink. The third argument in the hue function is brightness, which gives the distance from black. Setting brightness to 0 gives black. Like CMYK coordinates, the hue, saturation, and brightness coordinates are another set of coordinates for points in the RGB color space. This shows the RGB color space with black at the origin. Brightness gives distance from the origin, varying from black to white with shades of gray along the diagonal. Saturation gives the amount of color that is added, which in this color space is the distance from the diagonal. With hue set to 0, the color that gets added is red. The hue coordinate specifies which color is added, ranging from red to green to blue and back to red. The result is a conical coordinate system, with brightness giving the height of the cone, saturation giving the radius of the cone, and hue giving angular position around the cone. Actually, the coordinates for the HSB color space are based on a faceted cone like the one shown here. The basic idea is the same, with brightness measuring distance from black, saturation measuring the radius of the cone, and hue giving the position around the cone, but the actual HSB cone has planar segments so that the coordinates span the RGB color cube. The choice of color model can be important when features of an image are more evident in certain color channels. For example, separating this image of clouds in a blue sky into hue, saturation, and brightness channels gives a result where the hue channel is a perfectly uniform gray, which indicates that the image is actually entirely blue and the only differences between pixels are in saturation and brightness. The fact that all of the pixels have the same hue also shows up in the 3D chromaticity plot, where all of the pixels fall in a single plane. If that same image had instead been separated into red, green, and blue color channels, the fact that all of the pixels have the same hue would not really be apparent, since all three color channels would basically show the varying brightness across the image. Choice of color space can also be important for image operations that either have or should have different effects in different color channels. For example, this relatively dark and low contrast image is a good candidate for histogram equalization, since the image histogram shows pixel values concentrated at the low end of the range of possible values. Applying histogram equalization directly, however, introduces a sort of bluish tinge that was not part of the original image. This happens because equalizing all three color channels of this RGB image separately changes the ratios of red, green, and blue, which changes the color. What is needed here is brightness equalization, which can be done by converting the image to the HSB color space and then doing histogram equalization only in the brightness channel. For example, start by separating the image into hue, saturation, and brightness channels. Then apply the histogram transform function to the brightness channel and combine the result into a new image. The effect is to equalize the brightness histogram without modifying the hue or the saturation. So far, all of the examples have involved variations of the RGB color space. A completely different way of thinking about color starts with the underlying nature of visible light, since color is the way that we perceive different wavelengths of light. The entire visible spectrum of light extends from wavelengths of about 380 nanometers up to wavelengths of about 750 nanometers. It includes the range of colors from purple to red. Light with a wavelength of 640 nanometers, for example, is red. Light with a wavelength of 465 nanometers is blue, and so on. There are also many colors that are not part of that spectrum and that can be created only by a combination of wavelengths. The color white, for example, is not part of that spectrum. White can be created in many different ways, such as by adding yellow and blue, or by adding red and green and blue, or with an infinite number of other combinations, but there is no single wavelength that will give white. There is also no single wavelength that will give the color called magenta, which is created here by mixing blue and red. There are wavelengths of light that will give yellow. Light with a wavelength of 572 nanometers is yellow, for example, but a combination of a red wavelength and a green wavelength will also appear as yellow. If human eyes were spectrometers, then of course you could tell the difference between yellow light and a combination of red and green light, because the red and green would show up as separate lines in the spectrum. But human eyes are not spectrometers, and human color vision instead, for most people at least, derives from just 3 types of cells called cone cells that respond differently to different wavelengths of light. This plot shows the spectral sensitivity curves for 3 idealized types of cone cells. The cells identified here as type X are sensitive primarily to red light, cells of type Y are sensitive to green light, and cells of type Z are sensitive to blue light. The combination of X, Y, and Z determines the perceived color. Measuring the response of actual human cone cells would be very difficult, but it is possible with clever experiments to work out curves like the one shown here that show the same effect. The curves shown here were worked out by the International Commission on Illumination in 1931, hence the designation CIE 31. The values of X, Y, and Z are called tristimulus values. Each wavelength of light gives a particular set of values. Any combination of wavelengths that gives the same tristimulus values will be perceived as having the same color. For example, yellow, which is the color of light with a wavelength of around 572 nanometers, can also be created by combining a green wavelength and a red wavelength, since those wavelengths add up to give comparable totals for X, Y, and Z, and so the sum will be perceived as yellow. The values of X, Y, and Z can be treated as coordinates in a 3-dimensional color space. As with the RGB color space, different points in this space correspond to different colors. This line shows the range of X, Y, and Z values for the visible spectrum. Every color in that spectrum can be brighter or darker, which gives a cone of colors from black to arbitrarily bright. A common way to simplify this somewhat complicated diagram is to consider a cross-section of constant overall brightness. The projection of that cross-section into the XY plane is a plot called a chromaticity plot, or more precisely, a 2-dimensional chromaticity plot. Each wavelength of light corresponds to a point along that curve. Mixing colors gives colors that fall between the original colors, so filling in between the spectral colors gives a plot that, combined with differences in brightness, represents all perceivable colors, with spectral wavelengths around the edge. The RGB color space is a subset of this color space. The RGB color space consists of this triangle with red, green, and blue at the vertices of the triangle. There are several versions of the RGB color space. One version is called wide gamut RGB and uses different red, green, and blue points, but it is not possible with 3 fixed colors to get all perceivable colors. One last color space that is worth mentioning here is the LAB color space, which is a nonlinear transformation of the XYZ color space. 2 main purposes of LAB coordinates are to separate brightness from other aspects of color and to achieve what is called perceptual uniformity. The formulas to accomplish all of that are rather complicated, but the basic ideas are fairly simple. Perceptual uniformity means that the LAB color space is set up so that distances between points in the LAB space are consistent with the perceptual difference between the corresponding colors. Human perception is more sensitive to color differences at low brightness, for example, so these formulas have a cube root nonlinearity that gives larger distances between colors at low brightness. The formula for luminance L is determined by the value of Y, which is a reasonably good measure of overall brightness. The LAB color space is the basis for the distances computed by the color distance function, so the distances returned by the color distance function match perceptual differences. For example, here is the result from the color distance function for the distance between red and yellow. It is the same as the Euclidean distance between the coordinates of red and yellow in the LAB color space. The nonlinear relationship between color spaces like RGB, XYZ, and LAB has consequences for averaging and interpolation of colors, which means that it affects blurring, resizing, and many other operations that involve interpolating between pixel values. For example, here is an RGB image with red numbers on a cyan background. Blurring this image is done by replacing each pixel value with a weighted average of nearby pixels. Doing that averaging in the RGB color space gives gray borders around the red areas of the image because in the RGB color space, averaging of red and cyan gives gray. If the same blurring is done in the LAB color space, the color of the borders is again determined by the linear midpoint between red and cyan, but in the LAB color space, the color at the midpoint is not gray. That difference between interpolation in the RGB space and interpolation in the LAB space can also be seen graphically in a chromaticity plot. Here is the sequence of colors along a straight line from red to cyan in the RGB color space, and here is the corresponding sequence of colors along a straight line from cyan to red in the LAB color space. This shows both sequences plotted in the LAB space. The straight line in this plot is the interpolation in the LAB space, and the curved line, which would be straight in the RGB space, is the RGB interpolation. The curve of the RGB line means that it passes through a different set of colors, which is why the blurring worked out differently in the RGB space. This difference can be important both visually and in a variety of image processing algorithms that are affected by what happens at the boundaries between color regions. That's the end of the examples for this section. Here is a summary of some of the topics that were covered. Color is, of course, a basic feature of many images, and an understanding of how color works can be very helpful in choosing an appropriate color space for each application.